Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Nice to see everybody here for all of your favorite topic, the budget. I think these events are really important for us to come together, so I'm really happy to see a good crowd here today and good representation from different parts of the university. I think before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. And in my role as president, I want to recognize the need to learn about and respect the treaties that were made on these territories. And I want to affirm, as president, this university's commitment to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So last year, I was joined by our Chief Financial Officer and Controller, Mike Emsley. And this year, I'm going to pass the baton to Dr. Diane Hebert-Murphy, our Provost and Vice President Academic. As you know, in a provostial model, the budget falls within the Provost's office, and I think it's important for us to recognize that. And in this presentation, the two of them will lead it as we move forward. This is our second budget town hall since I was appointed as president. And it's our intention to host these on an annual basis and continue to to provide the information to our community. I'll have you know that I did these as Dean of the Asper School when I was there, but also did these and instituted them when I was Provost and Vice President at Toronto Metropolitan University. And you know, when you do these, sometimes we might have disagreements on how funds are spent. So sometimes the conversation could be a little tense, and not always, but I think that's good, and I think it's okay. We're not afraid of the hard questions. You should ask those hard questions. I think through honest dialogue, we will be better. I'll tell you that through our conversations at the Budget Advisory Committee of Senate, this presentation has evolved, and we've been pushed to provide different kinds of information in different formats so that our community can be informed. And so we continue to work on that. And, you know, I've kind of noticed over the last 3 years that the questions and the information we get asked for has become kind of, I hate to use the word pickier, but kind of more narrow because we're providing, we've responded in the way I think we need to respond, and we'll continue to do that. As you know, we're at the same time as this budget, we have a strategic plan that's evolving and working through the process, and the committee has been meeting. We've had now 2 or 3 meetings to work on kind of a draft that comes to the community, and there's still more work for that committee to do, but we're working on that. There's a reconciliation action plan that's been worked on, and that's hopefully also moving forward. And there's a research plan, which is closer to kind of ready in a final form to share with our community. And then we did budget model consultations, and by now we should all be exhausted of all of this planning. But there was a lot to do, and I think part of this was coming out of COVID. 2 years of COVID. We didn't do this kind of work institutionally during COVID, and so you know, we had a really busy year, and so you know, all of those are in one level of change and flux, and hopefully be ready to present to the community over the course of the next year. This presentation is also going to be shown to our community, and so it's going to be approximately 45 minutes. I guess I would ask that you please hold your comments and questions to the end so we can get through the presentation and then leave enough time at the end for questions and presentations. So if you're writing notes, make sure you tell us which slide that was on. This is being broadcast virtually for those who can't be here today. And so we'll also accept questions. And I had a little note about how you're supposed to do that. Something at the bottom of the screen, but now I can't find it. rsvp@umanitoba.ca. We're not accepting anonymous questions, so please let us know who you are. And we're committed to continuing this conversation. We're going to post the slides of the town hall on the town hall website, which is umanitoba.ca/town hall. And following the town hall, we'll actually post the entire video so that people can watch it and get a context for all of this and the questions. And so we want to make sure that not only are you able to do this, but our broader community can have access to this. And then those who aren't able to make it at this time, for many good reasons, can go back and watch it and then send us questions. So with that, I will now call up our provost, Diane Hebert-Murphy, to begin the talk.
Thanks very much, Michael. Well, good morning, and thank you for being here. So last year, I was viewing this presentation from Churchill. I was up with our research colleagues for the community opening of our research center there, and so was meeting lots of community members in Churchill and was seeing polar bears. I won't tell you whether it's going to be more fun to be here in person or be in Churchill, but here we are. So today we've put together a presentation which we hope will increase your understanding of how we go about budgeting at the university, where our revenues come from, where we're putting our revenue, and how we make decisions about how to allocate resources. So we're going to talk about generally how the process works. We're going to share the results of last year's financial results. We are going to talk about the budget year that we're currently in and some of the decisions that we've made around how to allocate revenue in this budget. And then we'll talk about some of the things we're thinking about going forward. So that's kind of where we're going. And Mike's going to start off, our comptroller and CFO, Mike Emsley, is going to start off, and we're going to kind of go back and forth as we do these various pieces. But that's what you're going to get, and as Michael said, we'll be happy to entertain questions at the end.
Okay, thanks, Diane. So I'm going to start with an overview of how we categorize the university's financial information. And so this slide provides a summary of our consolidated revenues based on the financial results for the year ended March 31st, 2023. Our consolidated budget includes both operating and non-operating activities. And when I say non-operating activities, those are the portions shown in yellow on the pie chart there. And they make up 29% of our consolidated budget. And when I say non-operating activity or restricted activities, I'm referring to activities that are funded by revenues with external restrictions on them. So basically, sponsored research funding, special purpose and trust accounts, endowment funding, capital funding, that type of thing. The outer ring of this pie shows the funding source. So you can see again in that yellow piece, provincial, federal funding, as well as other sources. The blue section of the pie shows the operating component of our budget, and that's really the academic, operational, ancillary costs that are funded by revenues like tuition and fees, government grants, or operating grant, investment income, and income from ancillary services. And this is really the part of the budget that the university has control over. And that's really the focus of today's presentation, is that operating component. These charts focus specifically on that operating revenues and expenses, the blue ring or the blue part of the ring in the previous chart. So the left chart here breaks down our operating revenue sources. You can see that about 54% of our operating revenue comes from the provincial government by way of a grant. The second largest source of funding on the operating side comes from tuition revenue, and that's approximately 31%. Of our operating revenue, and domestic tuition in Manitoba is regulated by the province. So between tuition regulation and the operating grant from the province of Manitoba, you can see that provincial policy decisions have a lot of influence on the university's operating revenues. Together they make up about 85% of our operating revenue. The pie chart on the right shows the breakdown of the university's operating expenditures at March 31st, 23. The majority of those expenses relate to people, so salaries and benefits make up about 3/4 of our expenses, with the remaining quarter in the non-compensation being things like facilities, operations, supplies. So the key message I want to leave from this section of the presentation is that government policy has a significant impact on the university's financial resources, and that salaries are a very big component of the university's operating expenses. Our most recent fiscal year, as I mentioned, March 31st, 23, or ended March 21st, 23, and I want to spend the next few slides kind of discussing the financial results for that year. So to set the stage for that discussion, it's useful to look back at the year and talk about what we were planning to happen last year. The budget was approved in May of 2022, and it anticipated a return to on-campus classes and activities with enhanced safety measures like masks and ventilation enhancements. Tuition went up 3.75%. The operating grant was held at the same level as the previous year, with the exception of some additional funding that was provided for an expansion in the nursing program. And we made some investments to enhance and advance research, increase capacity in the VP Indigenous portfolio, to advance our commitment to reconciliation. We established the EDI office, and we increased financial support for students. We did expect increased enrollment based on the results of the couple of years prior, which saw increases in enrollment, and we reduced the contingency funds that were allocated in the budget. And so the combination of the increased enrollment assumptions and reduced contingencies in the budget allowed us to flow more resources to faculties and units that were faced with increased salary costs resulting from recently settled collective agreements. So this slide summarizes the financial results for the university last year, and as is typical, our final results were a little different than we budgeted. On a consolidated basis, the university reported a $46.4 million surplus in 2022-23. The bottom gray bar here represents the portion of the surplus that related to non-operating activities, and that totaled $17.1 million. And that's really due to timing differences between when we recognize the revenue coming in and when the expenditures flow out. The upper 5 bars relate to that operating surplus, which totaled $29.3 million, which is about 4% of our operating budget. So that top pink bar, the $4.5 million, was actually, we were a little lower than we'd anticipated on tuition revenue last year. The second bar from the top, the gray piece, reflects the impact of better than budgeted results from other areas and activities on campus, and this largely resulted from activity last summer picking up a little more quickly than we'd anticipated. So things like mini university and some bison camps made a little more than we'd anticipated, in addition to a number of other things. The green bar represents unused contingencies and reserves in the budget last year. So we budget things like a pension reserve and other contingencies to mitigate risk and expenditures in the year, or to mitigate against shocks in changes to expenses from year to year. And in 22-23, $6.5 million of those reserves were not required to be used and led to a bit of surplus. The blue bar shows that investment income was higher than we'd anticipated. So you recall interest rates increased last year, mid-year, so we were able to make a little bit more interest income on some of our cash reserves. And then the red bar, 16.1% or $16.1 million of the surplus resulted from faculties and central units not spending their entire budget last year. And largely that's a result of unfilled positions or delays in being able to hire, as well as there were some supply chain issues that were still in play last year that delayed purchases and prevented us from being able to spend money in the year. So where did this $46.3 million go at the end of the year? Well, as discussed, the non-operating amounts are committed to future non-operating expenditures. We have very little flexibility on that. The $16.1 million that was saved by faculties and units is retained by those units to fund future expenditures and investments. And the remaining surplus was split between paying for additional support for students, topping up the university's rainy day fund, and an allocation to support future capital investments or deferred maintenance. So this slide provides a multi-year view of the university's operating surplus, and you can see that the 22-23 operating surplus declined fairly significantly from the prior year, and this was anticipated with wage increased costs due to collective agreements that had recently been settled and operations returning to normal after years of fairly significant less activity on campus. Units spent more of their budgets than they had in previous years. This is a combination of the previous two slides. There's a lot of information here, and I'm not really going to go through it in detail, but because we're providing these slides to the community, we wanted to include it in case someone wants to dig into the details, and we're happy to kind of speak to questions on it. So the previous slides showed the difference between revenues and expenses in a given year, and this slide shows the cumulative balance of those surpluses that are held by faculties and units or centrally for university-wide initiatives. And this chart shows those accumulated balances by area. When faculties or units underspend their budgets, they retain that surplus as carryover or it's allocated to provisions, and these funds are used to pay for future expenses. And so that you can see that accumulated surplus declined slightly in 2023 as the surplus was smaller than we'd seen in previous years, and we were able to start making some progress on investments that were really difficult to move forward during the pandemic. The orange component of the bar is the accumulated carryover and provisions balances for the faculties. In essence, this is money that was put in the bank and is yet to be spent. Often it was deposited in anticipation of specific purposes. Just like any money in a bank account, once it's spent, it can only be spent once. So once it's spent, it's gone. And that's why these carryover and provision funds are really targeted to be spent on time-limited or one-time expenditures. These funds are often used to fund initiatives like future capital needs, investments in program renewals or research seed funding, and provision balances include funds that have been earmarked for very specific things like faculty professional development expenses or TE expenses, internally funded research grants or grad student financial support that's been committed to people but hasn't yet been paid. Other operating units of the university likewise retain any unspent portion of their budget to spend on one-time investments, and those are kind of the little bars at the top. And that includes surpluses from ancillary services, which is the yellow bar, and they're really retained to support the maintenance and capital needs of our residences, parking lots and other ancillary functions. And the blue portion at the bottom is university-wide, provisions that are set aside for university-wide priorities, and I have a little more detail on that. So this pie chart is actually that blue section at the bottom of the previous slide, and breaks down that $160 million in carryover and provisions that's been set aside for university-wide priorities. So maintaining our campus infrastructure to support our teaching and research mission comes at a significant cost. Our classrooms, labs, and libraries are in need of attention and upgrade, and the university has several million square feet of buildings. Here at the Fort Garry campus, we're also responsible for maintaining our own roads and utility infrastructure. The very limited capital and maintenance funding we receive from the province is really inadequate to meet the maintenance and renewal needs of our facilities, and we don't have the resources to build in sufficient funding for maintenance and capital renewal within our operating budget. So that backlog of deferred maintenance grows every year. In addition to addressing the most critical deferred maintenance and infrastructure need, the university has allocated some of the annual surpluses available centrally to address unmet capital needs. So going through this pie chart in a little more detail, that you can see that $18.9 million has been set aside to invest in equipment at the Churchill Marine Observatory. That's the yellow slice of the pie. $20.9 million has been set aside for the renewal of McRae Hall. That's the orange slice, and that should be starting in the next year or two. The light blue component there is for approved learning spaces and infrastructure renewal projects that are underway. $20.3 million has been set aside, is shown in the gray wedge, to match federal funding for energy efficiency renovations on campus, and we refer to those as the ISIP projects under the program that they're funded under. And then the 20.4 million, the dark blue piece, includes investments for other capital projects, which include things like the hydro resurfacing project, the concert hall, and many other kind of smaller projects. So in addition to that, we have that green slice, which is committed to specific operating priorities, and that includes things like the renewal of the Human Resources Information System, future research overhead commitments, funds withheld for specific future employee benefits, and provisions for future income tax expenses, future tax expenses, not income tax. Also included in these university-wide priorities is a $28 million fiscal stabilization fund, or rainy day fund, which can be used to soften the impact of unexpected financial shocks if faced by the university. And as we've seen over the past few years, it's important to have adequate reserves in case things don't go as we anticipate. So as a charitable not-for-profit, the university's objective isn't to maximize our net income. Rather, we manage our finances to maximize our ability to deliver on our teaching and research and service missions while maintaining adequate reserves to ensure our long-term financial sustainability. No single measure of or balance on our balance sheet can capture the university's overall financial health, which is why several ratios were developed by a group of accountants from the international accounting firm KPMG to measure the financial health of universities. If you're interested, there's a full discussion of these ratios in the university's annual report, and we've included the link on the slide. The four ratios combine to provide a comprehensive score, or a composite financial index, and the score is measured on a scale of between -4 and +10. And where +3 is defined as kind of that minimum threshold of demonstrating reasonable financial health. With a composite score of 3.5, it's fair to say the University of Manitoba is in reasonable financial health. As these past few slides have shown, the size of the annual operating surplus has declined as costs increased more quickly than revenues, and this has been a good thing as more of our resources are being spent in support of our key academic mission. But we do anticipate this trend of expenditures growing more quickly than revenues will continue and will put pressure on our operating budgets moving forward. Overall, however, the university is in pretty solid financial shape. So I'll pass it back to Diane.
All right, I'm going to walk us through our 23-24 operating budget. Of course, we're about halfway through that budget now, and I'll tell you some of the decisions that we've made and what we're investing in. So this diagram really depicts how our budgeting process works. Looks kind of busy. I'll try to simplify it. So essentially, the university has what's called a hybrid RCM, or Responsibility Center Management model. So revenues come into the university, and we see here those revenues depicted as the provincial grant and the tuition, which are the largest, as well as some direct revenue. That revenue is allocated out to academic units based on some key drivers, primarily enrollment and research expenses. Then we have costs of central units. So those central services or units include things like our student supports, IT, HR, facilities. So the costs of providing those services are then allocated out to academic units based on drivers that are related to the particular cost. So, for example, the facilities costs are allocated out based on a unit square footage, so what they occupy on campus. So we flow out the revenue and we assign costs to academic units. At the end of that process, what happens is there are some units that do not have enough revenue to support the programs that they're delivering. So in order to do some redistribution and ensure that everyone has at least the minimum that they need to deliver what they've set out to deliver, we do some redistribution. So through a tax of our academic units, money flows into what's called the university fund. And in addition to the money that we get from academic units, we put some additional revenue in there that come from sources that aren't really directly attributable to any one unit. So things like investment income goes into that university fund. So we use the university fund to provide additional resources to those academic units who need it. And that's what's called subvention. So when you hear the term subvention, that's what it is. So we allocate money out from the university fund to bring those units up to a level where they can continue to operate and offer the programs that they do. Funds that are left in the university fund after we allocate out that subvention is used to invest in strategic priorities. Right. And so that's kind of how the money flows. Here's the process or the timing of how these things roll out over the year. I guess I would say it's always budget season. We get the budget to the board for approval in March, and then we start planning for the next budget year. So we start to work on what the planning assumptions are, and we get direction from government about what we can expect in terms of the grant increase and what we can expect in terms of allowable tuition increases. Central units work on their budgets in the summer and early fall, and they've just submitted them for the next budget year already. And academic units are a bit later in the fall. Every unit presents its budget to a committee, and there's lots of consultation along the way. So these committees are comprised of various stakeholder groups from across the campus, including Senate, faculty, staff, students, deans and directors, and so on. And again, we sort of work away at that budget. We do the allocations, and then sometime early in the new year, we get our official funding letter from the province, and then we make whatever adjustments we need to make if there's differences from what we were given in the planning assumptions. And we pull all of that together and take it to the board for approval in March. In 2023-24, the budget, these were some of the sort of the key assumptions or that we were working with, or that we were allocating revenue with. So we had, as Mike pointed out, been a bit optimistic or aggressive in our tuition estimates in 22-23, and so we were actually under budget in terms of tuition, and so we adjusted our expectations to be in line with what our 22-23 enrollments actually were. We were given guidance from the province that we could increase tuition up to a maximum of 2.75%, and with the understanding from the province that we would also be using some of that increased revenue to support student supports and some of the needs that we knew were arising in terms of our units in meeting the needs of students across campus. We received a very pleasant surprise. We were expecting a 0% increase on the grant, and we received a 10.8% increase. So I think collectively across the university, we breathed a huge sigh when we received that additional revenue. So what we had heard through the budget presentations, and this was consistent across all units, including central units and academic units, that their biggest cost pressure was meeting wage increases. Increases due to increments as well as negotiated general salary increases. So we knew that without some additional resources being put into those units, they were going to have to reduce their budgets. And essentially, when 75% of budgets are people, are salaries, it was going to have to be some cuts. So what we decided to do with this increased revenue is we decided that we would ensure that every unit would have what it needed to meet its wage increases, so that no unit through the budgeting process would be disadvantaged. So essentially what we did was we took that additional revenue and we allocated it out so that units had enough in place where they could meet the pressures that were on them around wages. What was left in revenue after we did that, we used to address some existing cost pressures that were in the budget. And we also established a one-time pool of strategic funding to the amount of $7.7 million. And we did a call out for proposals to try to access those strategic funds, and we allocated those out to projects across the university. Another pleasant surprise last year was that we saw an increase in what the province gave us for deferred maintenance. So we had historically received around 4 million for deferred maintenance, and last year the government provided us with 12.6 million. And so that combined with some of the additional, some money from operating, as well as some other funds, we kind of looked at what were some pressing needs for infrastructure renewal, and so we invested in those to try to start to reduce our backlog. This slide puts in perspective a little bit how our operating grant has moved over the last number of years. So again, 10.8% sounds fantastic, and it was welcomed. But it's not some huge windfall that's going to dramatically change the university. The top blue line represents, well, first of all, let me start with between 23 and 2017, we saw increases of about 2.5% in the operating grant. And that top line just estimates what our revenue would have been if we had continued to be funded with a 2.5% increase. What happened in 2017 and on was we didn't see an increase. We actually saw a flat grant or a declining grant over those years. So that's depicted by that bottom line. Sort of that dark blue. So you can see that the operating grant dropped between 2017 and 2022. We saw a little bit of an increase in 22, but that was really targeted funding to the nursing expansion. So with the 10.8% increase in the grant, it's brought us up. You can see in 23, 24, it's brought us up to that yellow line. That yellow line is just an indication of where our operating grant would have been had we had a 1% increase over those intervening years. So 1%, of course, is lower than inflation. So the 10.8 has brought us up to that level, but it's still not sufficient to get us to where we would have been had we had a 2.5% increase over those intervening years. And as I said, it's not keeping pace with inflation. All right, as I mentioned, we were able to make some strategic investments in 23-24. With some of that increased income, in addition to what we did around covering our salary costs, we were able to allocate out 14.5 million in some strategic investments. So I'll give you some sense about what we did. We allocated out 3 million in additional support for student scholarship bursaries and financial aid, and that's beyond the amount that was already in the budget and available through endowments and donation. We also allocated 3 million to address some capital improvements, so some of those pressing capital needs to in particular to make our facilities more accessible. We are facing some real accessibility challenges across the university, and we know we needed to invest more to try to address some of those. We invested 1.5 million to support improved ventilation on campus. We know that that's an increasing concern post-COVID. We invested 2.5 million in increased research funding to ensure that we had sufficient funds available for matching programs. Many of the programs that researchers engage in require matching, and as we know, with increased investment in Research Manitoba provincially, there's been increasing pressure on the university to provide those matching so our researchers can benefit from those matching programs. And we also provided some additional funding to support the development of interdisciplinary large team grants. We want our researchers to be increasingly competitive for those national competitions, and so we've put some investments to help the development of those grant proposals. In addition, we invested 4.5 million in various other initiatives, including initiatives to enhance our learning spaces, funds to support the implementation of our climate action plan, and some investment in improving some of our service levels in areas where we know that there's been increasing demand, and as a result, service levels have declined. We also developed that $7.7 million pool of funds that I talked about for strategic one-time projects. And we did a call out across the university, and we were able to fund 48 projects that are currently underway. And if you're interested in the details of all those various projects, you can look online, and we have a listing of what those are. And they are varied, and they are interesting, and we hope that they're going to have a really significant impact on our academic units, and as well as some of our central support units. This slide just helps put in context where we are in terms of our tuition revenue. As Mike talked about, tuition revenue constitutes about 31% of our revenue. This is Statistics Canada data, and it really speaks to where tuition is in post-secondary by province, so it's not by institution, but it gives you a sense of where Manitoba's post-secondary tuition lies relative to our peer provinces. You can see we are very much at the low end. The gray bar represents where the national average is. So certainly we are, and in many of our programs, are clearly the lowest among our sister institutions in terms of our tuition. To put this in context a little bit, if our tuition was at the national average, that would generate an additional $30 million annually that we could invest in our teaching and research mission across campus. As I said, tuition is an important part of our budget. And this just tells you a little bit where our enrollment trends are. We obviously pay attention to enrollment because any change to our enrollment, to credit hours taken, to the balance of our domestic and international students, all of that can have a significant impact on our budget. So this chart just shows you that our overall enrollments have stayed pretty stable. We saw a bit of a bump in our part-time enrollment during COVID. That's kind of returned to pre-COVID levels. You can see that we've seen, since 2019, a small decline in our domestic enrollment. That's largely attributable to demographic shifts. We've seen a decline in that 18 to 24 demographic in Manitoba. We actually expect that that is going to reverse shortly, and we're expecting that there will be small increases in domestic enrollment, probably in the order of 2% over the next decade, so we're starting to plan for that. And we've also seen a small increase in our international student enrollment. So it was very unclear what was going to happen during COVID. To our pleasant surprise, we were able to maintain our international enrollment, and we're seeing small increases. So pre-COVID, our international students made up about 19% of our student body, and in 22-23, it was about 22%. So again, a small increase, but we're staying pretty stable. In terms of academic programming, we continue to support and strengthen all of our existing programs, and we're looking for areas in which we can grow. We are certainly always in contact with stakeholders outside of the university to try to get a sense about what the trends are, where the demands may be. Many of our units work very closely with the business community, with industry, or with the not-for-profit sector, accrediting bodies, Indigenous communities, and so forth, to get feedback about where they see labor needs, and we're trying to be responsive to those demands so that we can work in partnership with to meet the needs of the labor force in Manitoba. We're also working to try to increase the range of options available to learners across the province. So we've been developing some micro-credentials, some shorter programs that meet some of the demand for upskilling or reskilling. There are learners who are not able to or who don't want to enroll in degree programs, but they want to participate in some of what we have to offer. So we've got a certificate and diploma framework, which is helping units figure out how they can use some of what they're already doing to maybe package those in ways or offer some things that are of particular interest to learners in the province and beyond. We continue to work at redesigning, updating, improving our curricula. A key area of focus is ensuring that all of our programs have Indigenous content, are including greater exposure to Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous perspectives in what we're offering, and we continue to be responsive to changes. And of course, we're also infusing a greater lens of anti-racism, anti-ableism, equity, and diversity into our programs. We continue to increase co-op for students. We have co-op opportunities in over 19 programs across 5 faculties, and many programs are looking at how to increase experiential learning in their programs, introduce more work-integrated learning and so forth to meet the career goals of the students that we have. And of course, we have been responsive to growing needs for very specific programs. So we have grown with the support of provincial support, our nursing programs, our respiratory therapy, our undergraduate medical education. We've grown business and engineering, and we have funding in place to increase our clinical psychology program. Mike talked a little bit about deferred maintenance. It's a bit of a daunting task. As we mentioned, deferred maintenance are simply needs that we have in our infrastructure that we're not able to attend to because we don't have the resources. So as aging university, and this is not unique to the University of Manitoba, it's true for probably most every university across the country, we are facing challenges in terms of deferred maintenance. We have over 100 buildings, past an average age of 50. I think we all know that past 50, things start to go bad, and we are experiencing that on campus. As Mike said, we're also, and you may not be aware of this, we're responsible for our roads, our sewer, and our power distribution systems. We have specialized research and teaching spaces that need to be updated with the latest technology in order to support those activities. We have the hydro resurfacing project, which is a large project. It's going to be upwards of $90 million over probably the next 10 years. And our infrastructure is out of date. We can no longer repair it, and we know that we have to address it. I'm sure you're all aware of the frustrating and sometimes lengthy power outages on campus, which is a huge problem for us. And so we've got a plan in place to start chipping away at that project. All right, so in terms of sort of takeaway messages for 23-24, we had an increase in the provincial grant, which was welcomed. It restored some of the cuts that we've experienced over the past 6 years. It helped us address some of our wage pressures as well as inflationary and other cost pressures. The province did commit to funding, increased funding in certain program areas, which was welcomed. Our increase in revenue in 23-24 is $50 million. The increase in our compensation budget will take $25.9 million of that, so that's just flowing out to meet our compensation costs. Our non-compensation costs increase sort of capture our increased investment in some of our strategic priorities, that one-time pool, as well as some other cost pressures. Again, we're continuing to invest as we can in our academic priorities, things that we've identified as a community as being important, and including supports for students and research. For those of you who want more of all of the details in terms of numbers, for those accountant geeks in our ranks, I would point you to the consolidated budget, which is online, and you can get more of the details there. All right, I'm going to turn it over now to Mike to talk about what we're thinking about moving forward in terms of the 24-25 budget.
Back to the accountant geek. So with the 23-24 budget approved and the year underway, we're now planning for 24-25. As Diane mentioned, it's always budget season here at the university. Earlier this summer, we provided units with some preliminary planning assumptions, and they've been developing their budgets accordingly. Central units have just finished developing their initial budgets for 24-25. They were due last week. I think we're still waiting on a few, just a gentle reminder. And they'll be presenting to the Central Unit Allocation Committee in October. Academic units are developing their budgets now and will be presenting to the Executive Budget Committee in December and January. The submissions and presentations help us to understand the priorities and cost pressures faced by units, as well as plans to address those pressures. Once we receive the funding letter from the province, typically in February, we update our revenue assumptions, finalize the budget based on the feedback we've received through the consultations and the discussions. And then we bring it to the Board of Governors for approval, generally in March, sometimes a little later, depending on the timing of when we get the information. At this point, there's a lot of uncertainty related to the 24-25 budget. As everyone knows, there's a provincial election on October 3rd, and as we discussed, provincial policy has a significant impact on the university's revenues. So the outcome of that election could have an impact on the university's financial situation. Two of our collective agreements expire in 2024, which leaves some uncertainty with respect to wage costs for 24-25. We make our best estimates based on expected settlements so that units can plan, and then we adjust as more information becomes available. And there continues to be increased demands for student services across campus, increased volumes of transaction for central support units like libraries, IT, human resources, finance, and the research office. This year, we're asking units to plan for a multi-year period, and this is the second year that we've taken this approach. We received positive feedback that the 3-year time horizon helped units to plan proactively. Overall, it allows us to be proactive in decision-making and to maximize the impact of the resources available to us and to responsibly manage our budgets. As I mentioned earlier, we do, at this point anyway, expect that revenues will grow more slowly than expenditures. But like I said, we'll update our assumptions later in the process when we receive the funding letter from the province. And this slide gives you a sense of how much more quickly we anticipate that expenses will grow than revenues over the next few years. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of preliminary assumptions in here. Things are subject to change, but this gives you a sense of the revenues in blue, the expenses in orange, that gap will continue to grow over the years based on the assumptions that we currently have. But, back to Diane.
All right. Last year at the town hall, we indicated that we were engaging in a review of our budget model. So we just wanted to follow up and let you know that that review did, in fact, happen over the last year. And we had a budget review steering committee that worked with Huron Consulting to review our process. There were many consultations across campus, or over 35 focus groups to get feedback on how the budget model was working. And at a high level, here are some of the findings of that budget model review. So the feedback we got was that we have increased transparency in understanding the revenue that's coming in and how that's allocated out across the university. People are generally understanding how the revenue flows in and where it's going. And units are indicating that they do feel like they have a voice in the institutional planning that goes into the allocation. Some concerns, however, were raised. We certainly heard that the model can result in some significant swings year over year, and that makes it very difficult for units to plan, and I think adds to a sense of being very conservative in using the operating grant, which certainly can contribute to surplus. We also have no real process by which to adjust subvention. What we've seen since the budget model was introduced in 2018 is that subventions have remained or grown during that time, which has reduced the amount of funding that we have available to address strategic priorities. So to address some of the findings, we've got a number of recommendations. One is that we revisit how we allocate out the provincial grant to ensure that there's less volatility and more stability so that units can count on a certain level of funding year over year. Recommendation is also that we address and develop a carryover policy to encourage the use of operating grants or the operating funds in year. And thirdly, that we perform a program cost analysis to address to identify and give us information that we can address any inequities that may exist in the system. There was a number of smaller recommendations that we're already working on around communication, improving the budget tools, and education around the budget model. One of the things that we are doing this year is Mike and I are coming out to all of the faculties and together with the faculty dean doing a presentation both on the university budget and on the units budget to increase transparency and understanding not only of what's happening at the broad university level, but what's happening at the unit level. All right, so in closing, we are trying to take a balanced approach to how we use our resources, trying to be responsible in what we have. We are using the resources to support the programs and services that we have, doing what we can to invest in some areas of strategic priority, and allocating money to critical areas of infrastructure renewal so that we have the spaces to support our teaching and our research. And we're going to stop there and open it up to questions. Thank you. So we can take questions here. And we have a mic, just so if you wouldn't mind using the mic, just so that our colleagues who are joining us on Zoom can hear the question. And Mike, I don't know if you want to join me, since I'm sure you'll have things to say.
Mike on the mic. My name is Michael Shaw from the Department of Biological Sciences, and I just have a question about something that I see in the data when you go to the organization of, or the Office of Institutional Analysis, and you look at the long-term trends at the university. We're up 20% in undergraduate students numbers, which is awesome, since 2013, and we're up 3% in UMFA membership since that same timeline. So when in the budgeting process are we going to talk less about deferred maintenance and more about deferred staffing? There's simply not enough of us right now. That trend has been continuing. None of the strategic priorities appear to address that there's not enough teaching staff at the university. And when we look even closer into those numbers, there were 937 assistant, associate, and full professors here at the U of M who were members of UMFA in 2013. There's now 936, one less. All of the growth has occurred in instructors, and I think that's great, being one myself. But if we're going to be a U15, when is the strategic priority around staffing and research staffing going to, I mean, we're up 20% and we're down 1 in assistant, associates, and full over that 10-year period. Where is that priority?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's a really good question. Certainly, as you know, decisions about allocating budget to faculty positions, whether that be in the professorial ranks or instructor ranks, is done at the level of the faculty. So centrally, we don't retain salary dollars. That was the way it used to be under the incremental model. It's not the way we do it now. So again, the money flows out and units have to do an assessment of where they're going to and how they're going to invest their resources. So those decisions are made at the faculty level. I will say those decisions are difficult when we have a flat grant. So, you know, we're trying to meet our salary increases, and we knew we needed to be more competitive on salary. That's been a huge priority for the university, and I think we've made some significant gain in that regard, and that's a good thing. But it does mean that there's less money available to allocate to new positions. So trying to balance out how do we remain competitive in our salary structure, and how do we grow to meet those growing teaching needs? I will say that the issue about instructor to professorial rank is one that we are paying attention to. Again, I think these decisions need to be made with a lot of collegial input. You know best your academic programs and what you need to deliver your programs. But as U15, absolutely, we need to be concerned about ensuring that we have an adequate pool of researchers to continue to advance that mission at the university.
And I wanted to make a couple points. That slide where you saw the tuition fees or the government grant, and it looked like we came back at a 1%. What we offered in whatever the first year was versus the last year is not the same. We've increased nursing. We've done a whole bunch of other things. So in fact, if you took all that money out that we got for the new programs, it'd actually be less. So that's one part. So the second thing is, you're right. We have to, and moving forward, we need to find a way. And so we need to balance then salary increases with increasing faculty complement. But I don't want this discussion to be deferred maintenance or faculty. We've actually fallen way further behind on deferred maintenance than we have on supporting the people here at the university. And most of that money has come from separate government grants, not within our budget. And so it can't be an either or, because we can have a lot of people, but if we don't have the classroom space that's upgraded, if we don't have the buildings, we've got an infrastructure issue here on campus. And we've been pushing government hard to be able to fund that. And, I think, as you saw from here, we're trying to balance all of that and take a balanced approach. What you show is that we've needed to increase enrollments by that much just to keep up to where we are. And so hopefully going forward, we can have some different discussions with government about how we move into the future.
Good morning. My name is Annie Chen, and I'm the lead in Community Engaged Learning in the new Career, Community, and Experiential Learning Center. That's in Student Affairs. Lots of words there. It's great to see the budget development process be more transparent and that leaders are having more of a voice in it. I was wondering, out of those focus groups and engagement process, if there were any recommendations or guidelines for engaging frontline staff in the budget development process. So I work, delivering programs and developing programs for students, and sometimes there's a disconnect between what we see on the ground with what I think leadership might see. So I'm just wondering if there are any institutional guidelines for engaging with the frontline workers to inform the budget that's developed.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we don't have institutional guidelines per se. We certainly include frontline staff on our committees that advise on the budget. And I think there's probably fair to say there's different practices across various units around how they identify their own priorities and move forward. But I think I would say that we are attentive and we are interested in hearing what frontline staff are saying and where those pressures are. But again, I think we can take that recommendation back and perhaps encourage some of our units to be more engaging with frontline staff. So it sounds like, if I can infer from your question, you would like to have greater involvement in that process.
And I just wanted to add, from an institutional perspective, we do have some avenues that we put in place to allow the community to provide feedback. So last year we did a survey. All faculty, staff, and students were invited to help us understand where their priorities were in the budget. And in the past year, we've gone through the strategic planning exercise, which everyone was invited to engage in, and that really is informing it at the institutional level. We're using those consultations to help figure out allocation of resources. But as Diane mentioned, we're a decentralized model, so absolutely engaging with your local managers and ensuring they understand when they're putting forward their proposals. That's really helpful as well.
Hi, it's John Sorensen from the Department of Chemistry. I'm hiding over here. Thanks. Thanks. First of all, I want to say thanks very much for the, maybe enjoyable is too strong of a word for a budget presentation, but certainly for just sort of the...
Don't go overboard, John.
For the opportunity just to kind of see how some of these decisions get made. And I think my question is a bit linked to my colleague Mike from Biological Sciences. If we're talking about increased enrollment and potentially increased staffing, instructional staffing levels, maybe not so much deferred maintenance, but is there a process in there? And it wasn't totally clear to me about looking forward to new academic instructional spaces needs as well. And in particular, I guess what I'm thinking is something along the lines of another large capacity lecture theater. You know, Schultz Theater was built 10 year ago, and we haven't had any kind of addition to that. We've had renovations, but no addition to that. So is that something that's kind of built into this budget planning process? And, you know, what are the thoughts about that?
You want to speak to capital? How would you? Yeah, so you're asking about what's the capital planning process. One of the things that we are doing is actually reviewing our capital planning process right now. So I think it's probably safe to say we haven't had a lot of capital sitting around waiting to be allocated, and we've been responding to the highest and most pressing needs moving forward. But I agree that we need a long-term capital plan for the university, and we're really looking at developing a new process that will ensure that there's good engagement across the university in identifying some of those priorities. And I think we need to move away, I personally think we need to move away from very siloed thinking about capital, and we need to come together to identify some spaces that can address a number of needs that we have, because those needs just continue to increase. So I guess stay tuned. We're going to see a new process, but I think you've identified a really important area that we need to have a very robust capital planning process so that we're ready when capital money starts to flow, and that's my optimistic self.
So, and I would just add to that, if you look at the medical school expansions that we've just taken part in, we linked those to a capital request because they needed more classrooms to be able to do that. And so they're going to be building 2 floors, I think it is, in the new building, and there'll be an increase in classrooms for them to be able to handle the larger size. And so we linked that expansion to it, and we were, we got government money to be able to do that, and together with some donor money and other pieces from the school itself, we're able to go forward in that case. And I think that's a little bit of a model of how, I think we've gotten to that point. We're a little bit of a model where if we're going to significantly expand, we're going to have to look at the spaces here on campus too and link that to some of the capital needs that we have. Questions online? No, nothing online. If there's any questions online, please put them in, but we don't see any at the current time. Perfect. All right, so this is an ongoing discussion, of course, but I want to correct something that Diane said. She said past 50, things go bad. She was talking about buildings. I just want to be clear on that. I hope you were talking about buildings. I think this is the end of our town hall, and I really appreciate your views and ideas as we move forward together as a university community. I think that these sessions are important, and I'm excited to have heard your perspectives, and I think we always find ways that we can do things better through this, and a different lens to looking at our situation as a university. And it doesn't stop here. I realize, some of you may go back, some of you may not have been comfortable to ask a question in this forum. But please, if you go back and do have a question, send us feedback and continue to share your ideas by contacting budgetconsultation@umanitoba.ca. And you can post questions there, and we'll try to get back to you on it, and also incorporate those comments and questions as we move forward. And I want to thank Mike and Diane and everybody involved in planning and supporting today's town hall. And we look forward to continuing this discussion. And also, both staff and faculty, please engage in your faculty councils and students when Diane and Mike come out. We're trying to start a new process and hear from faculty members at their level about what they need and bring a bit more consistency across the information that's presented around budgets to the faculties. So you have a real opportunity to engage at a much more local level when they come. I think you did the first one with the law school, so we have one under our belt, but their traveling roadshow will come to your faculty soon. So thank you, everybody. Again, if you want to ask a question or provide comments, budget consultation, B and the C are capitalized at umanitoba.ca. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. Take care and enjoy the rest of the day.